You don't fit in here. You never did. Pack your things and be gone by end of day." 14 words. Delivered in the hallway outside the gymnasium at Hargrove Preparatory Academy, loud enough that the 3 assistant coaches near the equipment room heard every syllable. Loud enough that the 2 secretaries at the far end of the corridor stopped moving. Loud enough that Marcus Webb, who had been coaching basketball at that school for 6 years, felt the words land in the air between them like something physical. He did not flinch. Director of Athletics Gerald Pryor stood with his arms crossed and his chin lifted, the posture of a man who had never once been told he was wrong in a room that mattered. He wore a pressed navy blazer with the school crest on the breast pocket, and he spoke with the particular confidence of someone who believed that confidence itself was a form of authority. The hallway was fluorescent lit and smelled of floor wax and old rubber, and every person in it had gone absolutely still. Not one of them said a word. Pryor turned and walked back toward his office without waiting for a response. The door closed behind him with a soft administrative click. Marcus stood where he was for a moment. His hands were at his sides, visible and open. His breathing was steady. He looked once down the hallway at the faces that would not quite meet his eyes, and then he walked toward the gymnasium. "Stay with this one to the end. Every detail is here for a reason." What Gerald Pryor did not know, standing in that hallway with his arms crossed and his certainty intact, was who he had just fired. He did not know what Marcus Webb had built, quietly and without announcement, over a career that had never once asked for recognition. He did not know what was coming, and when the truth came out, slowly at first, then all at once, it cost Gerald Pryor the only thing he had ever truly valued. But before we get there, let me take you back to the beginning. Now, here is what most people did not know about Marcus Webb. He had grown up in a 2-bedroom house on the east side of Columbus, Ohio, the kind of neighborhood where the grocery store closed at 7 and the streetlights flickered and nobody expected very much from anyone who came out of it. His mother, Darlene Webb, worked the overnight shift at a hospital laundry facility for 22 years. She pressed other people's sheets and folded other people's gowns and came home at 5 in the morning smelling of industrial detergent, and she never once complained about it in front of her son. What she did instead was sit at the kitchen table with him before school, her hands still red from the work, and tell him the same thing her own father had told her. "Stay low," she said. "Build high. Let the work speak when you can't." Marcus had been 10 years old the first time he heard it. He was 38 the morning Gerald Pryor fired him, and he had never forgotten it. He had played point guard at Jefferson High School, not because he was the most gifted athlete in the program, but because he understood the game in a way that coaches noticed and players trusted. He read the floor the way other people read a room, instinctively, completely, 3 steps ahead. He earned a partial scholarship to Crestfield University, a Division II program in Central Ohio that nobody wrote articles about, and he graduated with a degree in education, a coaching certification, and no illusions about what the path ahead would look like. He knew it would be long. He knew it would be quiet. He had been raised for exactly that. He spent his first 4 years as an unpaid volunteer assistant at a middle school in Columbus, driving 40 minutes each way on his own gas, learning the craft from a retired head coach named Earl Simmons, who had spent 30 years building programs in underfunded schools and who believed, with a specificity that bordered on religious conviction, that the way you coached young people was a direct expression of your character. Earl Simmons had a saying he repeated so often that Marcus eventually stopped hearing it as a saying and started hearing it as a fact. A player who trusts you will run through a wall. A player who doesn't will find a way to walk around it. Marcus had written that down. He kept it in a small notebook he carried in his jacket pocket. He moved up, slowly, methodically, without fanfare. A paid assistant position at a high school in Dayton. Then a coordinator role at a charter school in Cleveland. Then, 6 years ago, a head coaching position at Hargrove Preparatory Academy in Whitfield, Ohio, a private school with a well-funded athletics department, a gymnasium that smelled of new hardwood, and a student body drawn almost entirely from the wealthiest zip codes in the county. Marcus had not been the committee's first choice. He knew that. He had been told, indirectly, that the search had gone longer than expected, that there had been other candidates, that the board wanted someone who would be a good fit. He had taken the job anyway. In 6 years, he had turned a program that had won 9 games in the previous 2 seasons into one that had won 23 games in the last one. His players graduated. His players went to college. 3 had gone on to play at the Division I level, and one of them, a 6'2" guard named Darius Okafor, was currently in his sophomore year at a major conference school on a full athletic scholarship. Marcus had written Darius's college recommendation letter himself, 2 pages, single-spaced, specific in the way that only someone who had watched a young man grow could be specific. He had done all of this quietly. He had not sought press coverage. He had not campaigned for raises or titles or institutional recognition. He showed up every day at 6:15 in the morning. He left every day after the last player had gone home. He knew every player's name, every player's grade, every player's family situation, and he held all of it with the same steady attention he brought to the game itself. He had never once been late to a practice. He had never once raised his voice at a player in anger. That was who Gerald Pryor had just fired. Now, here's what you need to understand about Gerald Pryor. He had arrived at Hargrove 3 years ago as the new director of athletics, imported from a larger private school in the suburbs of Cincinnati, where he had spent a decade building what he liked to describe as a culture of excellence. He was 51 years old, silver-haired, and possessed of the kind of institutional confidence that comes not from accomplishment but from never having been seriously questioned. He had played lacrosse at a small liberal arts college in New England. He had a framed photograph on his office wall of himself shaking hands with a former Ohio State senator at a charity golf tournament, and he referenced it in conversation more often than he probably realized. Pryor believed in what he called program identity. He used that phrase the way other people use a key, to open doors, to close conversations, to signal that a decision had already been made before the discussion began. Program identity meant, in practice, a set of aesthetic and social preferences he had never been required to examine because no one with authority over him had ever asked him to. It meant a certain kind of coach, a certain kind of presence, a certain kind of fit. He had made clear, in the polite procedural language of institutional management, that he was not certain Marcus Webb was the right fit for the direction the program was heading. He had said this in a performance review 18 months ago. He had said it again, more pointedly, in a meeting 6 months ago that Marcus attended with his coaching record printed on 2 sheets of paper and his notebook in his jacket pocket. Pryor had looked at the record and said the numbers were fine, but that numbers were not the whole picture. He had used the phrase cultural alignment. He had used the phrase long-term vision. He had not once mentioned a specific complaint about Marcus's conduct, his players, his results, or his methods. Marcus had listened without interrupting. He had asked 2 questions, both procedural. He had thanked Pryor for his time and walked out. He had not told his players. He had not told the parents. He had not filed a complaint or gone to the local press. He had gone back to the gymnasium and run practice. That was the kind of man Marcus Webb was. What Pryor did not understand, what he had perhaps never needed to understand, in a career spent inside institutions that confirmed his assumptions, was that the players Marcus coached were not abstractions. They were 17 and 18 years old, shaped by 6 years of daily contact with a man who had taught them, by example and by repetition, that how you carry yourself in the hard moments is the only thing that belongs entirely to you. Pryor had the authority to fire Marcus Webb. He had exercised it. What he did not have, and what he had never thought to account for, was any understanding of what that decision would set in motion. He was about to find out. The morning after the firing, the gymnasium at Hargrove Preparatory Academy was quiet in a way it had not been in years. Not the quiet of an empty building, the quiet of a building full of people who had made a decision. 14 players had arrived for the scheduled morning walkthrough. They had changed into practice gear. They had laced their shoes. They had sat down on the bleachers in a single row, and they had not moved. The assistant coach on duty, a young man named Trevor Cole, who had been on staff for 2 years and who had been the one person in that hallway the previous afternoon to take a half step forward before stopping himself, stood at the edge of the court and looked at them. He had tried to start the session twice. Neither time produced any movement from the bleachers. Darius Okafor's younger brother, a junior named Calvin, sat in the middle of the row. He was the one who had called the others the night before. He had not made a speech. He had sent a single message to the team group chat at 9:17 in the evening. "We don't play without Coach Webb. Who's with me?" 13 responses had come back within the hour. All of them said the same thing. Trevor Cole looked at the 14 players on the bleachers and understood, with a clarity that surprised him, that he was not going to be able to run this practice. He also understood something else, something he had been turning over since that half step he had not completed. He pulled out his phone and sent a message to the one person at Hargrove he believed would actually listen. That person was Dr. Anita Reeves, the school's head of school, who had been in a budget meeting across campus when Pryor delivered his 14 words in the hallway. She had not been consulted about the firing. She had not been informed until after the fact. In a brief email from Pryor that described the decision as a personnel matter handled within his department's authority. She had read the email twice and then set it down on her desk and looked out her window for a long moment. Dr. Reeves had been an educator for 27 years. She had seen a great many personnel decisions made for reasons that were never quite stated plainly. She recognized the shape of this one. When Trevor Cole's message arrived, 3 sentences, factual, without editorializing, she stood up, excused herself from the meeting, and walked across campus to the gymnasium. She opened the door and stood at the top of the bleacher steps and looked at the 14 players sitting in a row in their practice gear, shoes laced, arms folded, not moving. She looked at Trevor Cole, who met her eyes steadily. She looked at the empty court, the clean hardwood, the scoreboard dark above the far basket. She said nothing for a moment. Then she asked quietly, "How long have you been sitting here?" Calvin Okafor answered for the group. "Since 6:15, he said. "Same time Coach Webb always gets here." Dr. Reeves nodded once. She took out her phone and made a call. The call lasted 4 minutes. When it was over, she walked back across campus to her office, sat down at her desk, and began writing a memorandum. The memorandum was addressed to the Board of Trustees. It was 4 pages long. Gerald Pryor did not know about the memorandum yet. He was in his office with the door closed, reviewing schedules for the spring sports season, operating under the assumption that the matter of Marcus Webb was settled and behind him. He had the particular stillness of a man who believes he has resolved something cleanly. He had no idea what was sitting on Dr. Reeves's desk, and it was about to change everything. The memorandum that Dr. Anita Reeves sent to the Hargrove Board of Trustees that Thursday morning was not written in the language of outrage. It was written in the language of institutional record, precise, documented, and devastating, in the way that precise documentation tends to be when facts are arranged without editorializing and allowed to speak at their own volume. She began with the coaching record. 6 years, 47 wins in the last 2 seasons combined. A graduation rate among varsity players of 100% across the entire tenure. 3 players placed at Division I programs. 1 player, she named Darius Okafor specifically, currently on a full athletic scholarship at a Big Ten institution, the first Hargrove athlete in 11 years to achieve that distinction. She attached the 43 letters of commendation from parents that she had located in the school's administrative files in under an hour. Then she turned to the termination itself. She noted that she, as head of school, had not been consulted before the decision was made. She noted that no formal performance improvement plan had been initiated, no documented complaints from players or parents had been filed, and no disciplinary process of any kind had preceded the termination. She quoted verbatim the language from Pryor's performance reviews, the phrases cultural alignment and long-term vision and program identity, and she noted in a single flat sentence that none of these phrases corresponded to any measurable standard in the school's athletics employment policy. She then described what had happened in the gymnasium that morning. 14 players, practice gear, shoes laced, 6:15, not one of them had moved. She ended with a single paragraph she had written and rewritten 4 times. She did not use the word discrimination. She did not need to. What she wrote was this: the pattern of language used to justify this termination, the absence of any documented performance basis, and the immediate, unified response of the student-athletes together constitute a matter requiring the board's direct attention and a review that this office is prepared to support fully. She sent it at 11:14 in the morning. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the board chair, a retired federal judge named Harriet Caulfield, had called an emergency session for the following Monday. Now, here is what most people did not know about Harriet Caulfield. She had spent 22 years on the federal bench. She had presided over employment discrimination cases and written opinions cited in subsequent rulings. She was 71 years old, small in stature, and possessed of a quality of attention that people who had appeared before her described uniformly as the most focused thing they had ever experienced. She had joined the Hargrove Board 4 years ago because her granddaughter attended the school, and she had sat through a great many board meetings in which she had said very little and observed a great deal. She had read Dr. Reeves's memorandum twice. Then she had called the board's legal counsel. Then she had called Dr. Reeves directly. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, Harriet Caulfield sent a single-line email to the board's executive committee. Monday, all members, no exceptions. Gerald Pryor received his notice of the emergency session at 3:47 that afternoon. The notice did not specify the agenda. It did not need to. He sat with it for a long time, and something in his posture shifted in a way that was not quite visible but was nonetheless real. He had spent 30 years in athletic administration. He knew what an emergency board session called without agenda specification meant. He picked up his phone and called his personal attorney. Marcus Webb, at that same hour, was at home. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, his notebook open in front of him. He was not drafting a complaint. He was not calling reporters. He was not on social media. He was writing down what he remembered of the last 6 years, not as evidence, not as argument, but because it had happened, and it was his, and he wanted it recorded somewhere that belonged to him. His phone had been ringing since morning. Parents, former players, Trevor Cole had called twice. He had answered Trevor's second call, listened for 3 minutes and said 6 words. "Tell them I'm proud of them." He had not said anything else. He had not asked them to continue. He had not orchestrated anything. 6 words, steady and warm, from a man who had spent his entire career teaching young people that how you carry yourself in the hard moments is the only thing that belongs entirely to you. He closed the notebook. He finished the cold coffee. Outside the kitchen window, the afternoon light fell at an angle across the backyard, and somewhere down the street a kid was bouncing a basketball on the sidewalk in that particular rhythm that sounds like impatience and readiness at the same time. Marcus listened to it for a while. He had no idea what Monday would bring, but he had been built for exactly this. The waiting, the stillness, the refusal to become something smaller than what he was just because someone with authority had decided he didn't fit. He had never fit their idea of what he was supposed to be. He had never tried to. That had always been the point. The Monday morning session was scheduled for 9 o'clock. By 8:40, every member of the Hargrove Board of Trustees had taken their seat in the formal conference room on the second floor of the administration building, a room that smelled of old wood and institutional carpet, and the particular tension of people who had read the same document and arrived carrying different versions of what it meant. All 12 chairs around the mahogany table were filled. Gerald Pryor sat at one end in the same pressed navy blazer he had worn in the hallway. His hands were folded in front of him. His attorney, a man named Douglas Fitch, who specialized in private school employment matters and who had driven up from Cincinnati that morning, sat beside him with a legal pad and the careful stillness of someone managing a situation he had not yet fully mapped. Harriet Caulfield sat at the opposite end. She wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the expression of a woman who had presided over proceedings far more consequential than this one, and who was prepared to be as thorough as the facts required. She had the memorandum in front of her. She had a second document beside it that no one else at the table had seen yet. She called the session to order at 9:02. She did not begin with pleasantries. She began by reading, aloud, and, without inflection, the coaching record that Dr. Reeves had compiled. She read the win totals. She read the graduation rate. She read the names of the 3 players placed at Division I programs. She read Darius Okafor's name and his current institution and the words full athletic scholarship and the phrase first Hargrove athlete in 11 years to achieve that distinction, and she let each of those words sit in the room before she moved to the next. Then she set the memorandum down and picked up the second document. It was a complaint, filed electronically at 6:47 on Friday evening with the Ohio Civil Rights Commission, filed by Marcus Webb through an attorney he had retained that same afternoon, not to retaliate, not to make noise, but because the attorney, A woman named Patricia Osei, who had represented educators in discrimination cases for 16 years, had told him plainly that the documentation supported a claim and that he had an obligation to himself to file it. Marcus had listened to her for a long time. He had asked 3 questions, all procedural. Then he had said quietly, "I don't want to make this ugly." Patricia Osei had said, "It doesn't have to be ugly. It just has to be true." He had signed the complaint that evening at his kitchen table, with his notebook open beside him and the cold quiet of the house around him, and he had felt something settle in him that was not anger and was not satisfaction. It was closer to clarity. The kind that comes when you have done the thing that needed doing and done it in a way your mother would recognize. Harriet Caulfield read the complaint number and the filing date into the record. She did not editorialize. She did not need to. Douglas Fitch's pen had stopped moving. Gerald Pryor's hands, still folded on the table, had gone very still in a way that was different from before. The stillness of a man recalibrating. The stillness of someone who had believed, until this precise moment, that the matter was settled. Harriet Caulfield removed her reading glasses and looked at Pryor directly. She asked him in the measured voice of someone who had asked a great many questions from a great many benches to describe the documented performance basis for the termination. Pryor spoke for 4 minutes. He used the phrase program identity twice. He used the phrase long-term vision once. He did not cite a single specific incident, complaint, or documented deficiency. Harriet Caulfield let the silence after his answer stand. Then she said, "So, there is no documented performance basis." It was not a question. It was a finding. Fitch leaned toward Pryor and said something quiet. Pryor nodded once, slightly. He did not speak again for the remainder of the session. The board voted at 10:19. The motion was to place Gerald Pryor on immediate administrative leave, pending a full review of the termination decision and the school's compliance with its own employment policies. The vote was 11-1. The single dissenting vote came from a board member named Richard Holt, who had served on the athletics committee for 7 years, and who had originally hired Pryor, and who sat very still after the vote was announced and did not look at anyone. The motion also included, in its second clause, a directive to Dr. Reeves to contact Marcus Webb and invite him to a meeting at his earliest convenience. Pryor left the room at 10:22. He walked down the hallway with Fitch beside him, and the sound of his footsteps on the institutional tile was the only sound in the corridor. The door to the stairwell closed behind him. The room held its breath for a moment. Then Harriet Caulfield said, to no one in particular, and everyone assembled, "Let's talk about what we're going to do to make sure this never happens here again." That was the beginning of the reckoning, not the end. The full review the board commissioned took 3 weeks. It was conducted by an outside firm specializing in institutional employment audits, and it was thorough in the way that reviews tend to be when initiated by a former federal judge who has made clear that thoroughness is not optional. The firm reviewed every performance review, every email chain, every meeting note in the school's administrative files touching on Marcus Webb's employment over 6 years. What they found was not complicated. It was simple in the way that most injustices are simple, when the documentation is laid out in sequence without the protective fog of institutional language. There was not a single documented complaint about Marcus Webb's performance from a parent, a player, an administrator, or a colleague. Not a single formal warning. Not a single performance improvement plan. There were 43 letters of commendation from parents, a coaching record that placed him among the top 3 winning percentage coaches in the school's history, and a player development record that was by any measurable standard exceptional. And then there were the performance reviews. 2 of them, written by Gerald Pryor, containing the phrases cultural alignment and program identity and long-term vision, none of which corresponded to any written policy or measurable standard. The auditors noted that these phrases appeared in the reviews of no other coach in the athletics department. They appeared only in the reviews of Marcus Webb. The report was delivered to the board on a Tuesday afternoon. Harriet Caulfield read it that evening and called Dr. Reeves at 8 o'clock. The following morning, the board's legal counsel contacted Patricia Osai. That conversation lasted considerably longer. It was professional, precise, and conducted in the language of people who understood that the documentation made the school's exposure significant, and that the most dignified resolution available was one that did not require a courtroom. Patricia Osai was not interested in a quiet settlement. She was interested in what Marcus Webb was interested in, which was not a check and a non-disclosure agreement. What Marcus Webb wanted, as he had told her at his kitchen table with his notebook open beside him, was for the record to be corrected, for the termination to be formally rescinded, for the documentation to reflect what the documentation actually showed, and for the school to put in place, in writing, the kind of structured employment protections that would make it harder for the next Gerald Pryor to do the same thing to the next Marcus Webb. Those were his terms, all 4 of them. He had stated them once clearly, and had not negotiated any of them downward. Patricia Osai had written them on her legal pad in the order he had given them and underlined each one. She had looked at him when he finished and said, "That's a strong position." Marcus had said, "It's the right position." 7 words. She had understood everything. The board accepted all 4 terms. The acceptance was formalized in a written agreement signed by Harriet Caulfield on behalf of the board and by Patricia Osai on behalf of Marcus Webb on a Thursday afternoon, 3.5 weeks after Gerald Pryor had stood in a fluorescent-lit hallway and delivered 14 words to a man whose worth he had never taken the trouble to understand. The termination was formally rescinded. The personnel file was corrected. The 2 performance reviews containing the phrases cultural alignment and program identity were removed from the official record and replaced with the notation that the prior reviews had been found to lack documented basis. The school adopted a new athletics employment policy requiring any performance-related action to be preceded by a documented review process with specific, measurable criteria. And the policy was named, at Dr. Reeves's suggestion, which the board accepted unanimously, the Webb Standard. Gerald Pryor's administrative leave became permanent separation from the school on the same day the agreement was signed. He did not contest it. Douglas Fitch had advised him, after reviewing the audit report, that contesting it would not serve his interests. Pryor cleaned out his office on a Friday afternoon, after the school day had ended and the hallways were empty, and carried 2 boxes to his car in the parking lot without anyone watching. The framed photograph of himself shaking hands with the former Ohio State Senator was one of the things he took. He set it in the back seat and drove away. Richard Holt submitted his resignation from the board 2 weeks later. His letter cited personal reasons. Trevor Cole, the assistant coach who had taken that half step forward in the hallway and stopped himself, and who had then sent 3 sentences to Dr. Reeves that set everything in motion, was offered a formal contract extension and a raise. He had been on a year-to-year arrangement for 2 years. The new contract was 3 years. He accepted it the same day it was offered and said only "thank you" in the way that people mean things when they have been recognized for doing something that costs them something. Dr. Reeves did not seek recognition. She had written the memorandum because it was the right thing to do, in the language the situation required, and when people later asked her why she had moved so quickly, she said only that the facts were not complicated, and that her job was to pay attention to the facts. Marcus Webb returned to Hargrove Preparatory Academy on a Monday morning, 4 weeks and 2 days after Gerald Pryor had fired him in the hallway. He arrived at 6:15, the same time he had always arrived. He parked in the same spot. He walked through the same entrance. The gymnasium smelled of floor wax and new hardwood, the same as it always had. He pushed open the gym door and stopped. All 14 players were already there. They were in practice gear, shoes laced, standing on the court in a loose arc facing the door. Calvin Okafor was in the center. He was holding a basketball. He was not smiling exactly. It was something more serious than a smile, more considered. The expression of a young man who had learned something about himself in the past 4 weeks and was still in the process of understanding what it meant. Marcus stood in the doorway for a moment. He looked at all 14 of them. He looked at the clean hardwood and the dark scoreboard and the morning light coming through the high windows at an angle that turned the floor to something close to gold. He walked onto the court. He took the basketball from Calvin's hands. He held it for a moment, feeling the weight and texture of it, the familiar pressure of the seams against his palms. He said 4 words. "Let's get to work." And they did. What happened in that gymnasium over the weeks and months that followed was not a miracle. It was not a movie ending. It was something quieter and more durable than either of those things. It was 14 young men who had learned, in the hardest possible way, that the values their coach had been teaching them, about how you carry yourself in the hard moments, about what belongs entirely to you, were not abstractions. They were not things you said. They were things you did or you didn't, and the difference was visible and permanent. They played the rest of the season. They won more than they lost. They played with the particular focus of people who understood what the season meant and what it had cost to get back to it, and they played it the way Marcus Webb had always taught them, with discipline, with composure, with the understanding that how you move through the game is an expression of who you are. Darius Okafor, watching from his college campus several states away, had been offered by a reporter the opportunity to make a statement about what had happened. He had declined to make a speech. He said only that his coach had taught him everything he needed to know about how to handle a situation like this, and that watching the team handle it the same way was the proudest he had ever been of anyone. The reporter had asked what the coach had taught him. Darius had thought for a moment. Then he said, "That not fitting into someone else's idea of what you're supposed to be is not a failure. It's a fact, and facts don't need your permission to be true." The reporter had written it down. It ran in the article. It was the line that people remembered, not fitting in. That was what Gerald Pryor had decided Marcus Webb's problem was. That was the shape of his certainty, the architecture of his error. Marcus Webb did not fit. He was not the right kind of presence. He was not aligned with the culture that Pryor had decided, without documentation or basis or any standard that could be written down and examined in the light, that the program required. What Pryor had never understood, and what 14 players sitting in that gymnasium at 6:15 in the morning had understood instinctively, was that the culture of that program was Marcus Webb. It had been built by him, year by year, player by player, 6:15 in the morning by 6:15 in the morning. It lived in the graduation rates and the recommendation letters and the notebook in his jacket pocket, and the maxim his mother had given him at a kitchen table in Columbus when he was 10 years old. Stay low, build high, let the work speak when you can't. The work had spoken. It had spoken in 43 letters and 100 wins and 14 players who had laced their shoes and sat down and refused to move. It had spoken in a memorandum 4 pages long and a complaint filed at 6:47 on a Friday evening, and a vote of 11-1, and an agreement signed on a Thursday afternoon that bore his name in its most permanent clause. Not with anger, not with revenge, with record and restraint, and the particular power of a man who had always known exactly who he was, and had never required anyone else's recognition to remain it. The Webb Standard required that any performance-related action against a coach or athletic staff member be preceded by a documented review process with specific, measurable criteria, written notice, and a minimum 60-day improvement period unless the conduct in question involved a violation of law or school policy. It required that all performance reviews be cross-referenced against written departmental standards before entering a personnel file. It required that the head of school be notified and consulted before any termination decision was finalized. It was, in the language of policy, a modest reform. In the language of what it meant, it was a wall built in the place where a door had been left open. It would not stop every Gerald Pryor who would ever sit behind an athletic director's desk. But it would make the next one slower. It would make the next one leave a record. And a record, as Marcus Webb had learned from his mother and from Earl Simmons, and from the long, quiet years of building something no one could see until they couldn't ignore it, is the thing that outlasts the people who would prefer it didn't exist. Patricia Osai had told him, after the agreement was signed, that the case would likely be referenced in future employment discrimination proceedings in the state. He had listened and said, quietly, that he hoped it helped someone. She had said she was certain it would. He had thanked her, shaken her hand, and driven home. The drive took 22 minutes. He had made it hundreds of times. He knew every traffic light, every turn, every stretch of road where the trees came close enough to the shoulder that in the late afternoon the light came through them broken and gold. He made it now in the quiet of a Thursday afternoon, windows down, spring air moving through the car, and he felt the particular weight of a thing that has been carried for a long time and has finally been set down. Not dropped, set down. With intention, in the right place. He pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment before going inside. Down the street, a kid was bouncing a basketball on the sidewalk. The same rhythm he had heard from his kitchen window weeks ago. Impatience and readiness, the sound of someone waiting for the game to begin. Marcus listened to it for a moment. Then he went inside and called his mother. Darlene Webb answered on the second ring, the way she always did, without waiting, the particular readiness of a woman who had spent a lifetime being prepared for whatever her son needed to tell her. She was 71 years old. She still lived in the 2-bedroom house on the east side of Columbus. The kitchen table was the same table. He told her it was over. He told her how it had ended. He did not use legal language. He told her that the record had been corrected, that the school had put something in place to protect the people who came after him, and that he was going back to work. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did you stay low?" He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Did you build high?" He said, "I tried to." She said, "The work spoke." It was not a question. He said, "It did." She told him she was proud of him, simply, without elaboration, the way she had always said the things that mattered most, as though they were facts that did not require decoration. He thanked her. They talked for a few more minutes about ordinary things. Before she hung up, she said, "Come home soon. I'll make the kitchen warm." He said he would. He sat at the kitchen table for a while after the call, in the quiet of the house with the afternoon light falling through the window at the same angle it always did. His notebook was open in front of him. He was not writing anything. He was simply looking at the pages, the years of notes, the names of players, the things Earl Simmons had said, the observations he had made about the game and the young people who played it, and the way that teaching them was, if you did it right, a form of testimony about what you believed the world could be. He thought about Calvin Okafor sitting in the center of that row on the bleachers, shoes laced, not moving, 6:15 in the morning. He thought about what it had taken for a 17-year-old to do that, what it had required him to understand at 17 about what mattered and what didn't, and what you do when the thing that matters is taken from you without justification. He had not taught Calvin to do that. He had taught Calvin the principles from which Calvin had derived that action himself. That was the difference. That was the whole of it. Stay low. Build high. Let the work speak when you can't. The work had spoken. Not only in his record and his documents and the policy that bore his name, it had spoken in 14 young men who had laced their shoes and sat down and refused to move, who had looked at what had been done to their coach and decided, without being asked, without being organized, without anything except the values that had been modeled for them every day for years, that they would not participate in a world that pretended it was acceptable. That was the thing Gerald Pryor had never understood. You cannot fire a culture. You cannot terminate the thing that a person has built inside other people. You can remove the person from the building. You cannot remove what they have placed in the people who remain. Pryor was gone. The school had moved forward. The board was working. The policy was written. The file was corrected. And in a gymnasium that smelled of floor wax and new hardwood, 14 young men were learning the game from a coach who arrived every morning at 6:15 and left every evening after the last player had gone home, and who carried a small notebook in his jacket pocket, and who had never once raised his voice at a player in anger. The world is full of Gerald Pryors. Men and women who sit behind desks in institutions and make decisions about who fits and who doesn't, using standards they have never been required to write down or defend or submit to any examination, because no one with authority over them has ever asked them to. They move through those institutions with the particular confidence of people who have never been seriously questioned, and they make their decisions in the language of culture and alignment and vision, and the people those decisions fall on are, with a consistency that is not accidental, the people who were never meant to be in those rooms in the first place. And sometimes, not always, not even often enough, but sometimes, the record catches up. Sometimes the documentation is there, because someone kept it. Sometimes there's a Trevor Cole who takes a half step and then later takes the full one. Sometimes there's a Dr. Reeves who reads an email twice and recognizes the shape of something she has seen before. Sometimes there is a Harriet Caulfield who has spent 22 years on a federal bench and who knows exactly what it means when a room full of people cannot produce a single documented reason for the thing they have done. And sometimes there are 14 young men who lace their shoes at 6:15 in the morning and sit down and refuse to move, who have been taught by example and by repetition that how you carry yourself in the hard moments is the only thing that belongs entirely to you. Marcus Webb carried himself the same way his mother had carried herself through 22 years of overnight shifts in industrial detergent, and a kitchen table where she sat with her son before school and told him what her own father had told her. He carried himself the same way Earl Simmons had carried himself through 30 years of building programs in underfunded schools with no recognition and no fanfare, and a belief, specific as a covenant, that the way you teach young people is a direct expression of your character. He carried himself that way because he had been shown that it was possible, because the people who raised him had done it first. This happens every day. In schools and offices and institutions across this country, someone who has built something extraordinary in silence is told, in the language of culture and fit and vision, that they do not belong. And the people who tell them this are certain. They are always certain. Their certainty is the architecture of the whole thing. What they do not account for is the record. What they do not account for is the people who have been watching. What they do not account for is the 14 players who already know, because they have been taught that the only thing that belongs entirely to you is how you carry yourself in the hard moments. Marcus Webb carried himself with dignity. He carried himself with restraint. He carried himself the way his mother had taught him at a kitchen table in Columbus when he was 10 years old and the world had not yet shown him everything it was capable of. He stayed low. He built high. He let the work speak, and the work spoke loud enough for all of them to hear. If this story stayed with you, I want to ask you one question, and I want you to think about it before you answer. Have you ever watched someone be dismissed, passed over, pushed out, told they didn't fit, and known, in a place you couldn't quite name, that the person doing the dismissing had no idea who they were dealing with? Drop a comment and tell me what you saw. Tell me what you did or what you wish you had done. I read every one of them, and I want to hear it. If you believe that the people the world overlooks deserve to have their stories told with the care and the gravity they earned, then subscribe to this channel. Every week we find those people. Every week we tell the truth about what they built and what it cost and what it meant. That work matters, and it only continues because you're here.